Welcome everyone to King's Politics. My name is Miz, one of the co-chairs at King's Politics, and we're delighted to be joined by Tasnime Akunjee.
Pleasure, thank you.
He's a defence solicitor in the field of terrorism and terrorism-related offending, well known for being Shamima Begum's family lawyer, fighting and advocating for her return. On a brief back format, I'll ask a couple of questions and then we'll give it to the audience. As a first question, how did you initially get involved in the case, and what motivates you to specialise in this particular area?
I think a glutton for punishment is probably the most appropriate answer to that one, given how long this has taken and how it's progressed. But really, it started in roughly February 2015. I happened to be in Finland at the time, and a person from East London Mosque, his name is Salman Francis, a person known to me, he contacted me. The families of Shamima Begum, Khadija Sultana and Amira Abbas, they had approached the mosque in order to get some pro bono legal assistance, and then they were referred on to me, so that's where that connection occurred.
I guess, what is the legal basis that justifies Shamima Begum's return in your view?
Well, the reality is that she's a young woman who was born in this country, raised in this country, and has no other passport for any other country on this earth apart from this one. Bangladesh is the country where her parents hail from, and because of a device to do with immigration rules, the Secretary of State decided that that would give him an opportunity to deny her citizenship based upon her parental sort of state of origin. But her right to be here comes from the fact that she was born here, and that the only way that that can be removed from her is if, under the current law, the Secretary of State made the correct decision that she was not conducive to public good in his assessment, as well as the decision wouldn't leave her stateless. And those are the contentious issues in her case.
How do you navigate the court of public opinion in this case? As you are probably well aware, her return is quite a controversial subject. Many in the British public opinion are against her. How does one navigate sort of that convention?
Well, I think it sort of depends on which part of public opinion you're looking at. If you're looking at the Daily Mail, you're going to get a certain view, but if you're looking at the Guardian, that's another segment of the public opinion, and you'll get a very different view. And so I think in any case that's contentious, it's natural that in a country with 67 million people, there's going to be a number of different views on display. So in terms of navigating that, what we try and do is remind the public that actually we're not dealing with Shamima Begum per se. We're dealing with a British citizen whose fundamental rights are being affected in a way that could affect any other citizen in this country. So regardless of the nature and the character of the person involved, we're dealing with everyone's rights when we're dealing with hers.
As you mentioned, in 2019, Sajjad spoke about citizenship, and I guess you framed this as the need to protect the British people. You responded by arguing that this was a political-driven abuse of power. Is there any validity to the government's argument that they need to protect?
Well, I wrote a letter to Sajjad, I don't know if you don't mind, I can quote it. I wrote it to him on the 29th of May, and published it publicly in the Times newspaper. And on that particular point, my views about his decision were, and I quote, "Your act represents the most profoundly egregious, capricious and politically driven abuse of power. It was a unilateral, unprincipled response to the publishing of Mr. Lloyd's interview, deployed as an artifice or device to further your own political, personal objective of being Prime Minister. Miss Begum was a pawn in vanity, and her baby died." So that's just a quote what my view on that is regarding why he did what he did by stripping her.
I guess touching on that, and sort of in more recent interviews, Sajjad has gone on record of saying that if people knew what he knew, they would be against her return, and that there's been, I guess, concern with other intelligence reports. Is there any validity to any of these claims, and how does one navigate these claims as well?
So if people knew what Sergeant Javid knew at the time, Boris Johnson would have been arrested or at least fined for lockdown parties. So the idea about what he knew and what he didn't know is an issue that requires a bit more examination. What has been leaked by his own department at the time was the idea that Shamima Begum was selling suicide vests into ISIS fighters, and also a leak that suggests that she was part of the morality police in ISIS territory. What will come out is that at very least one of those leaks is completely unsubstantiated and was leaked effectively, in our view, by purpose in order to cast aspersions about it in a politically charged environment. Both those assertions are denied strenuously by Ms. Begum.
I want to touch upon the Supreme Court ruling. And of course, the Supreme Court effectively overturned the Court of Appeal's decision, which was in her favour. I guess Lord Reed, the President of the Supreme Court, his argument was essentially that the Court of Appeal did not pay enough heed to the Home Secretary's desires to protect the public good. Is there any validity to that argument?
So there were a number of different things argued. Firstly at the SIAC, then applied at the same time with the Home Office. So SIAC, it was argued, which is the Special Immigration Appeals Commission. This is the first court of law where somebody stripped their first right to appeal a decision of the Secretary of State. And that court is limited to judicial review principles. They can't really examine proportionality issues regarding whether somebody is or isn't, or how much of a threat they may possibly be. But what was argued there was that that she was, by her defence, was her status as a UK citizen and not as a Bangladeshi national. So that was rejected by the SIAC court. They said that she was, had access to Bangladeshi citizenship. And simultaneously, she also applied outside of immigration rules in order to get entry clearance to the UK. So as she was no longer a British citizen at the moment that Sergeant Shepherd stripped her, she was entitled to apply for leave to enter. And the reason we asked for leave to enter was that so she could engage the appeal process. She has a right to appeal, and because she was in a refugee camp with practically zero access to any communications, and where there was access to communications, that they were, we couldn't be sure that they weren't monitored. So she wasn't able to give instructions to solicitors. So we argued that it was the only safe way for her to actually engage in the appeal process was to bring her back to the UK, so she could give instructions to lawyers and respond to any of the issues that were raised by the Home Office, her behaviours, vests and such like. Now, the SIAC courts first, they rejected that in a very, we would say, surprising way, where they accepted that she was unable to give instructions to lawyers, and therefore she was unable to engage properly with the appeal process that was afforded to her by Parliament. But that, according to them, did not necessarily mean that she won her appeal on that basis. So we appealed that decision, and the Court of Appeal were with us on this. Their idea, one would think quite properly, was that access to justice and the right to have an effective appeal was more important than the idea that the Secretary of State had about a potential risk to the UK public. And the Supreme Court effectively reversed that, re-implementing the position that just because you can't engage in an appeal doesn't mean you necessarily win one. And so a lacuna was created whereby they said, yes, she doesn't have the right, or she has got the right to an appeal, she doesn't have the ability to engage it, and therefore what we'll do is stay the appeal indefinitely until such time as she can get in contact with lawyers and then engage that appeal process at that time. So that is the state of play with respect to that element of it, and further arguments will be had in November of this year.
I guess with the situation with the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal, do you think they failed in their duty to, I guess, uphold and protect human rights?
I would say that the decision was very surprising, given the nature of the case and the various arguments deployed at the time. A fuller, a more rounded argument will be happening in November, and that will encompass a great deal more information at that time. I would hope that the courts would then apply a sensible mind to what comes out there.
I guess moving beyond legal arguments, how does one, I guess, morally approach the situation? I guess there's two camps. There's one group which would argue that this mistake was treacherous and there's others who argue that she was a teenager and she should be forgiven. How do you sort of navigate this?
Well, the thing is that even on her family side and on those who are representing her, nobody's asking for her to be forgiven at all. They're arguing, and we're all arguing, that if, as a British citizen, she's committed any offences, the right and proper place for the idea of whether she's been guilty of any offences is in a court of law, a criminal court of law, and to be judged through the examination of evidence by 12 members of her peers, which are us, really. And without that, then we can't have a moral judgment on the issue. This stripping of citizenship, is not just denying Shamima Begum her right to have a trial, it's denying the British public the right to examine somebody that they're vilified to see whether they were justified in that through an open and transparent trial process.
Do you think Shamima Begum has, I guess, been a pawn of a broader political game in regards to the government?
Well, my view was quite clear, and I've expressed this directly to Secretary Evans. I believe that she was a pawn in his personal game. And the reason I believe that is because before Shamima Begum, there were roughly 12 to 1,800 people who had left the UK to go and join ISIS and other groups as well. And before she had been discovered in Al-Hol camp in 2019, there were at least 400 who returned with the knowledge of our government. Some of those people, Sajid Javed had admitted himself, were not an insignificant risk. They weren't the lowest risk, which means they imposed something of risk. But we don't know their names, and we know that none of them had their citizenship stripped, and we also know that only 20% of them had ever faced any sort of arrest or even charge since. So 400 people in the same class as Shamima Begum, some of which were arguably more dangerous, have returned before, and 20% of them have faced criminal justice, as they should do. But that specifically, she had been singled out for not being afforded those rights.
You of course represent the family in this case. How has the family dealt with this ordeal over time? What must be a series of ups and downs?
Well, it's been 7 years. So it represents pretty much half of their experience with their own daughter or sister, as long as they've known them. She was 15 when she left. And when she left, it's normal for any family to want to try and get her back. I was instructed to assist in that. And I think most of the country were trying to, at the time, 2015, have these girls tracked down and have them returned. But the zeitgeist of things have changed. So I will say that whenever Shamima Begum's name comes up in the press or the media, that she has nephews and nieces who suffer atrocious abuse at their schools, young as they are, because people poke ridicule them because of their association familiarly with her. So it's been a very trying time for them.
I guess I'll put this as a last question before I give it to the audience. What does the future of the case look like? Are you optimistic that some justice will be served?
Yes, I am. I think that it is a very contentious case, and we see the nature of how difficult the judiciary find it to grapple with the exact sort of issues here, because you have a Court of Appeal very clearly saying that the idea of access to justice and a right to a trial is more important than anything else. And then you have the Supreme Court, the higher court, who then reverse that position to say, actually, in these circumstances, a politician's view about danger is more important than an individual's view and access to a fair trial. So we have fundamental differences of approach between the lower court and the higher court. And I think that shows and demonstrates quite clearly how contentious these issues are when the courts themselves are rather diametrically opposed to their approach to this situation.
I'll give it to the audience, so if the audience has any questions, just please put your hands up and I'll come to you. I'll just go here first.
Thank you for doing that. I just wanted to ask, do you think there's a level of hypocrisy with people who say they're sort of bastions for human rights, but as soon as human rights apply to a character which they find unsavory, all of a sudden they're against the very principles which they seek to uphold.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I mean, the thing is that in your question, you're approaching the situation with an idealistic purity. And life isn't really like that. And there are always exceptions to every situation. The idea of transparent government is fundamental to democracy, but by definition, you need to have secrets because you have enemies that would take advantage of your absolute truth if you had it that way. And so there are necessarily situations that are difficult for society, that are maybe hypocritical in terms of the purity of the idea, but unnecessary. But our argument here is that this was a young girl who was groomed and taken abroad. And if we as a society can't accommodate and mitigate the risks of a child, then we're not worthy as a society.
Thank you.
Like you say, Shamima Begum was groomed over here in the UK, and I just wanted to kind of get your perspective on like the role of like the school and the local authority in preventing that from happening, and recognizing that will happen.
Well, that's a very important question. It's one that we've been asking for a while, and in 7 years we haven't had an answer to. The one answer we have had to that is that there will be no examination of that officially. So, to get the full picture on that, there were 4 girls who went to Syria from that school. One was Shamima Begum, and one was Shamima Begum, Khadija Sultana, and Mira Abbas. The first girl is unrelated. She leaves in December 2014 to Syria. The school's aware of this, her father is aware of this, but none of that information is shared with anyone else. The police, however, identify Shamima Begum, Khadija Sultana, Amira Abbas, and a number of others to question. The school doesn't tell the family that their own children are being questioned around the first girl's disappearance in Syria. So what we say is there was an absolute failure of safeguarding there, because just communicating to the family that one of these girls' close friends has gone to Syria would have at least allowed them to apply their own ideas and recognizance around protecting their children, asking them some more questions, maybe taking their passports out of circulation, these sort of things. But that didn't happen. And so when a child is lost, or it dies, or what have you, in the normal circumstances, what's known as a serious case review is implemented by the local authorities. So they look to see an investigation, what went wrong, what lessons can be learned. And we asked for that to happen. We demanded for that to happen. Tower Hamlets at the time was taken over by a new mayor, John Biggs, and he repeatedly refused to do that. And we have asked now 3 or 4 times. It's been called for in recent podcasts in the media. And I believe that when the next mayor election comes up, there'll be yet another question to be asked. Because losing 4 girls from one school to ISIS and another 5 on top of that, potentially were to be lost if it weren't for the intervention of the courts. Well, that's the worst case of child radicalisation in the Western Hemisphere, and yet nobody wants to ask any questions about the full government.
So first of all, thank you for the talk. I guess my question is related to larger constitutional principles at the bigger picture in itself. Do you think that the Supreme Court's argument of using democratic accountability as grounds for judicial deference was justified? And if so, and if not, does that speak to the larger principles of with the rule of law and the separation of powers?
Well, I think we've had that question answered really by recent bills that are proposed in Parliament, which definitely remove the idea of a separation of powers. The idea that a higher court will come up with a decision that's constitutional, and yet politicians can reverse that. That's anathema to the idea of a separation of powers and the idea of political accountability. Now, in my own view, and it is in my own view, Boris Johnson, in his journey through what we say is his premiership, had very clearly said to not just the courts but to the BBC as well, that he has them in their target because he was exerting political pressure on institutions, attempting to sway them so that they move in his direction. And I would say that the legal community was surprised at some of the decisions in the Supreme Court. I would leave the rest to your conjecture.
So thank you for being here this evening. So we've had the recent Immigration and Borders Bill distinguishing foreign-born British citizens, and we've had the various justifications put forward for keeping Shamima Begum from re-entering the United Kingdom, one of which being, she has the right to claim Bangladeshi citizenship. To what extent do you think these two instances, I'm sure there are many more, are part of the wider environment, hostile environment, being created for certain British citizens?
Well, I think it's of a piece. The phrase hostile environment surfaced around Theresa May. Much of the case law that was generated by illegal deportations were very clear in that those deportations were illegal. The compensation scheme that was set up, that Sajid Javid as Home Secretary was meant to be fixing around the whole that affair, was criticised as laughable. The idea that people would be paid only if they signed off non-disclosure agreements about the amount of money that they would be offered, and the circumstances around it again was anathema to the idea of solving a problem cleanly. And then beyond that, we've had a government that's gone out of its way to other entire sections of the community and to silence them, or potentially silence them through new bills being proposed that limit your right to protest. Even this particularly highly contentious act, Section 40 of the British Nationality Act, the act used to strip people of citizenship, it was never used up until 1948. And beyond 1948, it was used a handful of times until very recent days. It was attempted to be used to remove Abu Hamza from the country, and they failed to do that. And when they failed to do that, they changed the terms of it so that instead of having to prove as a high bar that somebody was involved in activities that were detrimental to the fundamental nature of the British state, a very, a sort of Guy Fawkes level event, it was taken down to not being conducive to the public good, which is just being a bit raucous maybe. So you see a trend, and it's not fair to only put it at the feet of the Tory government. I mean, these changes happen on the table there. But you have seen a trend of very much away from people's fundamental rights generally. And when you have a government that's targeting the right wing in terms of the press and its public support, then when everyone's rights have been eroded, then a particular community is much easier to focus against because they're in the target. But another community will come next.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for coming. I sort of have two questions, but both relate to the nature of your work. So, in terms of this case specifically, is there a large team of lawyers? Are you one of several defence solicitors? And again, are there several barristers involved in the case? I guess, how small or how large is this team? And then the second question perhaps is more, I would imagine this case would absorb a lot of your professional time, but are you concurrently working on other cases?
So this didn't start as a case. It started as advice to a family around what do you do when one of your children might be in Syria. And that's actually quite an odd situation. When I say odd, I mean whatever you think a family would do isn't necessarily legal in that particular circumstance. So you would imagine that parents would be beside themselves. They'd want to send money or resources to their child to help them to come back. But actually you can't do that, not in these circumstances, because the family could be arrested for funding terrorism. So when you get into the terrorism space, things that you think are obvious, suddenly you find out belatedly are illegal. So we were there to advise them what the parameters of possibility were. This really only became an actual legal case in 2019 when her citizenship was stripped. Otherwise, all we were dealing with was a child in very difficult circumstances and advising around how to navigate across borders to get them back to their family should the opportunity arise. And we attempted to do that in 2016 for Khadija Sultana. We had a rescue mission for her. There was another girl who we managed to successfully get back. But at the very last minute, Sultana decided that she wasn't willing to take the risk. The risks were significant. She ended up staying in Syria and was killed 3 months later. So there are a lot of issues to navigate. But when you get to an actual case level, in 2019, the number of lawyers involved were 2 solicitors, 1 barrister. We were working pro bono. I went out to Syria to try and get her signature and advise her, and we went out into the camp. At the time, there was a huge influx of refugees coming out of the Baghouz scenario and flooding into the camps, and it wasn't safe enough, according to the YPG, for us to enter. And so we ended up having to bring a case on her behalf, literally based upon what she'd said to media, which is, I will come home. So we formulated a case around that. And at that point, when it was put into the SIAC courts, we handed over to another legal team who had legal aid in the case and could run it and finance it. You need a special contract with the government to be able to finance these special type of cases. And I think their team is 3 solicitors and 2 counsel. I do have other work, otherwise I'm not
in terms of Shamima's child, what was the government's argument for not assisting him or her?
It was entirely disingenuous, an argument. So we wrote a letter at the time when his name was Jared was born, and the conditions in the camp were recognised by the World Health Organization as being quite dire. There was a very high child mortality rate there. And Jared was born a British citizen. So we wrote to Sergeant Javed and explained that whatever the circumstance for Shamima was at the time, those were to be discussed in court at some point. But we have a British citizen here who's in danger, and we don't need their assistance. We just need them not to stand in the way of us going there to collect him. And if they could provide some assistance, that would be great. We were told that it was too dangerous for any government official to go to Al Roj refugee camp and assist. Now, this is at a time when 6 British journalists had already interviewed Shamima Begum, one literally hours after she'd given birth. So if the BBC can send their correspondents there with the appropriate risk, I don't see why, our SAS or our security service didn't have the backbone to do the same, or at least the orders behind that. So it was entirely disingenuous. I myself went there and, got a few mosquito bites, but that was about it, really. Why didn't they? Because they didn't want to. That's as simple as that. And he died as a result.
I've got another question. Sorry, so this second question is about SIAC and that whole process. So, and the effect that might have on the outcome of the case. So while our judiciary, they do a great job, I'm sure. What impact do you think that having or holding the case behind closed door, with immigration judges, a lay person that's from MI5, something that the proceedings that the public aren't privy to? Do you think, in some ways, in your opinion, that might lend some possible, not bias, but it might work a bit more in favour of the government because it's not where the public aren't privy to the proceedings?
I'll refer back to the first question and my answer to that, which was that there is a necessity for secrecy in certain parts, even though it's not pure to the idea of transparent government. There is a necessity for that. But I'll caveat that with abuse never happens in the daytime. It happens in the dark. And what we saw here was material that was closed, which apparently was collated by the security services and put in front of Sergeant Javed, clearly designed to be closed material. The idea that she was sewing suicide vests and things and part of the morality police crisis. That should have all been enclosed evidence. So how is it that the Secretary of State let it slip into the Daily Mail rather than behind closed doors of a closed court because it's so secret and so necessarily secret? How did that happen? Because if we'd done that, we'd be in jail.
Yeah. Thanks.
So we've seen with members of the government across these few years making certain decisions which eventually in the courts have been deemed to be unlawful. Do you think, and it's probably a bit of a constitutional question, that politicians, especially those holding ministerial positions, should be a bit more legally educated or a bit more in the know than they are, so that they can prevent these sorts of decisions being made, such that they exceed or go beyond powers or give themselves powers which don't exist?
I know
Do you
you
think they should just make decisions and
I know
be decided in court?
I'm mindful that we're in Cambridge, but our Prime Minister went to Eton and Oxford. I don't think he has a deficit of education. I think he has a deficit of honour, honestly.
Next question.
In considering the fact that she was being positioned now to go to Syria, I would argue that she was definitely groomed, and she was probably incredible emotional vulnerability to be able to travel into Syria. How have the courts kind of managed to counteract that argument that she was in a diminished position, and what do you think of justification?
It's a fair question, and to be fair to the courts, they haven't turned their mind to that because they've been asked to turn their mind to that question yet. So that is something that they will be turning their mind to in November. And so this comes under the Modern Slavery Act. It's the issue to do with a child having been trafficked and also being in a sexually exploitative relationship. So we know that she was in Syria within 2 weeks of her being there at the age of 15. She was married under an ISIS ceremony to a 23-year-old national. So that would be statutory rape. And there are particular provisions around that the UK has, treaty obligations internationally. But to be fair to the courts, that has not been pleaded yet and will be pleaded in November. And those international treaty obligations impose very strict duties upon those in government to assist people in those scenarios, and actually also specifically to have them repatriated where possible. Again, when the court turns their mind to it, I think the treaty is very, very clear. Again, if you're interested in it, it's all contained in a letter with Mr. Those points in particular were outlined to him, and it's been published in the Times as well. So he's fully aware of that from March 2019, but the courts will decide in some time in November.
Next question.
For you personally, what's been the most challenging aspect of dealing with this case?
The death of Khadija Sultana in circumstances where we were very close to having her return home safely.
Next question. So I'm really balancing at the back.
I think you have Schrodinger's hands on the back, the up hand down.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. Considering that her citizenship is revoked because she has a dual citizenship, how has this sort of worked with like the Bangladeshi officials? What has been their sort of take on it, considering she doesn't necessarily have ties beyond her parents?
So the courts are concerned with de facto, or with de jure citizenship, not de facto. The case law talks about this in these circumstances. So as long as there is a legal argument, in theory, that she has citizenship, the courts have attached a great deal more on the black and white letter of the law as it appears, rather than whether or not someone is in fact able to exercise access to citizenship in practical terms. I think, again, that issue is going to be revisited as well. It's fundamentally unacceptable that just because a piece of paper says you can have something when things are there, that's called fraud in the UK. If you were to buy something as advertised and it just never showed up, you expect a refund. So in this circumstance, it's about as clear as day that Shamima Begum's so-called access to Bangladeshi citizenship was very clearly undermined, that idea of that, by the Foreign Minister of Bangladesh, who said that A, she is not a Bangladeshi citizen by the operation of a complex of their laws, and on top of that, if she were to return to Bangladesh, she would probably be executed. So he was quite happy to say that publicly. And that really brings into stark relief our our position. A country that she was born in, raised in, educated in, radicalized in. She bought her ticket to Syria with pound sterling, not tacos, and she used a British passport to get there. There is no nexus between her and Bangladesh. And so in terms of this scenario, our Home Secretary gaining that the Bangladesh is a problem with Bangladesh, we've classed that as human, as basically dumping one's own problems onto another nation. It's human fighting.
So the British media has worked sort of very hard to create this particular narrative around Shamima Begum. What have you found is sort of the most effective way to counter that narrative? Sort of what
to ask Donald Trump a question around it. And he bizarrely, we're on the same model page as Donald Trump on this one. It says, take your people home. So I mean, if someone is, let's say, unsophisticated, as Mr. Trump can see the clarity of the situation, then one has to wonder what particular goggles are politicians wearing in order not to see it.
Next question. Someone me?
As a counter to the government's rationale for making the decisions it has, how could one argue that Shamima's presence in this country would be conducive to public good?
Well, there are 400 other people who've gone to Syria, returned before Shamima Begum, who have been assessed as not an insignificant risk. So the issue is parity. So if you have fighters who've gone over there and come back, the full knowledge of our government before she's come, then what's the difference between her and the others? Why has she been singled out? Is that proportional? Now the reality is that the reason she is so widely known is because a very public decision was made around her. So we can't very well rely on the government making a meal out of her existence in the media to then say, well, because a meal has been made out of it, then she can no longer return. But Shamima Begum, that name was like John Smith, really. And she wears a hijab and a burqa, sometimes not. So if she were in East London, I would imagine that she'd be difficult to spot.
Next question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, given all these problems that we're discussing, like the nature of politicians, the corruption that exists within our society, do you think these are actually problems that are features of democracy, or do you think they're actually fluid within our society, and there is a version of democracy or society where we can overcome these problems?
There are 8 billion people plus on this planet with different cultures and different politics and different systems of governance. We generally are alive, generally moving in the right direction, greater degree of education for most people, greater access to justice for most people, a greater life expectancy for most people. These are things we should celebrate. But these are through very different systems. The Chinese have a very different system to the UK. I mean, the French have a very different system to anybody, really. And yet there's corruption everywhere. And yet there's corruption in democracy, there's corruption in autocracy, there's the legalization of corruption when you have dictatorship. So I don't think it's peculiar to any system. I think as soon as you get human beings together and you dangle a big enough carrot, some of them get a bit naughty.
But do you think it's kind of inherent within any system that we have?
It is, because it's inherent to the human condition. I mean, unless we replace humans with AI robots, then maybe we'll fix that problem. I think it's just a function of our biology and the way we are.
Next question.
Has Shamima been exposed to treatment that's contrary to Article 3, the ECHR, inhuman and degrading treatment? And if she has, how has the government responded to its neglected, I guess, positive obligation to prevent that treatment? Is it the fact that by denying her British citizenship, it isn't therefore obliged to?
That's exactly right, yes. So by denying somebody citizenship, you're denying their ability to engage in a lot of the rights that would normally be afforded to them, a duty that would be upon government. But we do have extraterritorial obligations in terms of human rights and what our decisions as a government have on the individual. Those have been argued. Now, in terms of the risk to Shamima Begum, she was in a Al-Hol refugee camp initially, and such was the threat to her life because of the even guarded things she said that were vaguely negative towards ISIS. She was moved by the YPG out of that camp and into a separate camp with, Al-Hol had 80,000 people, and Al-Raj has 2,500 people, and it's much better run, much more secure. I would say that if you want to think about whether or not her human rights have been affected, I will say this: there is no criminal offence that you could commit in this country where a judge anywhere in this land could sentence you to being in the situation she's in that would be illegal. And that's what I'd say on that.
Next question.
We saw in the early interviews that she used to wear a niqab and some she was wearing a hijab, and then there was one interview where she kind of very much westernized herself. Do you think that was purely to appeal to mainstream media over here, or that was purely because she wanted to?
Shamima Begum was not a leader. She was someone who was groomed as a child and followed a group of her friends over to Syria. So she had decided to don the Islamic garments as a 15-year-old child because her friends did so. She went over to Syria and decided to wear and be there because her friends did so. And she's now in a YPG refugee camp in dire circumstances where she's been counselled by some of the Kurdish female sort of guards there. And I would say that Shamima Begum, if anything, is a product of her environment, has always been a product of her environment. And so what you see of her now is a result of the product of her current environment.
Next question. Any other questions? Unless I'm not seeing someone's hand.
I've got one more if you don't mind. So, I strongly agree with you. Shamima Begum was a child, and I think it's deeply unfair that that's not really given the weight that it deserves. With that in mind, do you think there's any scope in the law? I mean, I know this is wishful thinking, but any scope in the law to take the age or the background or the context in which a person grew up in, so that they're not exposed to such harsh consequences of their actions?
We say that exists in the law. It exists across a range of different things. So in criminal law, the age of criminal responsibility is 10. In terms of whether somebody's groomed and whether they have various treaty rights, the age is 18. Any child below the age of 18, if they've been trafficked or if they're in the context of a sexual abuse situation, then that is taken into account, and they have a defence to almost any criminal offence. There's a list of exceptions. Beyond that, even if somebody were taken in as a child and abused, moves into majority in the context of a sexually abusive relationship, they are still considered trafficked people. So the law is there. It's there to have people turn their minds to it. And I think that's one of the big reasons why our current government has been so ardent in not allowing her to come into the UK, because a judge and a court would have to apply the law, whereas when she's in a refugee camp, nothing's applied to her.
Thank you.
So I'll go here first.
Something?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So if she was brought back to the UK, what charges would she potentially face? And I guess what punishment would go with that?
I think this might be the crux of the issue. I don't believe she could face any charges. The only offence that there is evidence of is her joining a terrorist organisation, which would normally be an offence under the Terrorism Act 2000. However, when she left, a declaration was made by the then head of the Metropolitan Police to say, and in writing, to say that they would be treated as victims and not as criminals, unless there was further evidence that came to light that suggests other criminality. So we have a legitimate expectation, or Shamima has a legitimate expectation, which is an ancient principle, against prosecution for that one criminal act that there's evidence for. Beyond that, there's no evidence of any other criminality. So how embarrassing would that be for Shamima Begum to return to the UK and she simply cannot be prosecuted for anything? And I believe that's one of the reasons why she's been singled out.
Hi, so I wanted to ask about the media that we saw of Shamima Begum. So I'm sure most people have seen it. I think that, personally, I think that a lot of it was exploitative and intending to make a mockery of her and then using it and kind of painting a picture of her that was really negative. What was your view on whether or not she was even allowed to go out into the media? And as her counsel, I'm assuming you had some sort of role in maybe facilitating that, or maybe even advising her on whether to do it or not to do it. And sort of why did you allow her to go when she was quite vulnerable and in that position that she was?
So we had nothing to do with that. I've personally never spoken to Shamima Begum. I've never been able to. Communications are very, very limited, and that's only recently. Even a family, you have a phone call for less than a minute once every 3 months or so, and that's when the opportunity arises and they don't know when. So this is defence flying in the dark. Much of our initial instructions were based upon what she said to Anthony Lloyd in his interview there. So we have extrapolated from that and created a defence or an application case in terms of an appeal from that. So what she says and how she says it and why she says it, we have zero control over at all. Any lawyer would think that it would have been best if she hadn't spoken to the media. But the fact is that we live in a democratic country. We have journalists. Their function is to go and find stories and information. Their function is not to look out for the interests of the individual themselves. It is to report on something that's in the public interest. Some of the reporting around this has been morally repugnant, but a journalist doing their job or reporting on the facts is a tenet of our democracy and an important part of it, and I don't stand in the way of that. They are to do their jobs and we are to do ours.
Any other questions? Nope. So I guess we'll end it there then. Can we have a big round of applause for